High-ranking officer ordered a royal guard to salute, but didn't expect that kind of response. He had spent more than 3 decades in the army, climbing through the ranks with a combination of skill, strict discipline, and a sharp mind for strategy. Today, he found himself walking through the grand courtyard of the royal palace, a place that few outsiders were allowed to see up close. The palace was a marvel of architecture, with tall, shining gates, polished marble floors, and walls adorned with intricate carvings that told the history of a long line of kings and queens. The sunlight reflected off the gold accents, making the entire place look as though it had been touched by magic. Hawthorne's boots clicked against the stone in steady rhythm, a sound that seemed to echo across the vast open space. He had been sent here to inspect the ceremonial royal guards, a position of honor, but also one that required absolute precision and discipline. Hawthorne had always believed in rules. He had spent his life teaching soldiers to follow orders without hesitation, to act with precision, and to respect the chain of command. In his mind, a soldier's obedience was not just a duty, it was a form of honor. As he approached the line of guards, his eyes scanned each figure with the trained gaze of a man who had spent years observing human behavior. The soldiers were all dressed in their ceremonial uniforms, which were spotless and immaculately arranged. Their polished boots gleamed under the sun, and each weapon was held perfectly straight, as if an invisible hand had adjusted them just moments before. But one figure caught his attention more than the rest. This guard, Sergeant Elias Moore, stood slightly apart, not because of arrogance or laziness, but because there was a sense of calm in his posture that seemed almost unusual. Unlike some of the others whose eyes darted nervously when they noticed Hawthorne's presence, Moore's gaze was steady, focused, and unwavering. There was something about the way he carried himself that told Hawthorne he was a man who knew his duties well, but also someone who thought for himself. Hawthorne's curiosity was piqued. He had encountered many soldiers in his life, but few who seemed to radiate quiet confidence in such a way. As Hawthorne drew closer, he could see the perfect alignment of the guards in the long line that stretched across the courtyard. Their helmets reflected the sunlight in blinding flashes, and their white gloves were spotless. Everything was perfectly arranged, like a scene frozen in time. The precision of the formation impressed him, as did the unwavering attention to detail. Hawthorne, who had always valued order, felt a sense of satisfaction at the sight. Yet, he also felt a familiar desire to test the limits of discipline, to see how far obedience went. He stopped a few steps in front of the line, his boots making a sharp, echoing sound as they struck the marble floor. The guards stood perfectly still, their eyes forward, their hands gripping their ceremonial swords. Hawthorne's presence alone was enough to command respect, but he wanted to see more. He wanted to see if the soldiers would react with mechanical precision, or if there was something more human beneath the layers of ceremony. He wanted to see if they had the courage to show character, even within the strict rules of their duty. Hawthorne raised his hand slightly, signaling his intention. "Attention!" he called out in a voice that carried across the courtyard like a trumpet. The guards snapped to an even more rigid stance, their movements synchronized as though they were part of a single organism. Hawthorne's eyes lingered on Moore. The sergeant's posture was flawless, but there was a subtle difference in the way he held his head. He wasn't just following orders. He seemed aware of the significance of the moment. Hawthorne stepped closer, his sharp eyes narrowing slightly as he prepared to issue a simple command. He had done this countless times in his career. An order given, obedience followed. It was a dance of authority and compliance, a ritual that reinforced the hierarchy he had spent years building. Yet today, something about Moore made him pause. There was a feeling that this guard would respond differently, that there was a story hidden beneath the surface of that perfect uniform. "Salute!" Hawthorne barked, his voice crisp and commanding. The other guards responded immediately, their arms rising in precise, identical motions, hands perfectly aligned with their helmets. The uniformity was impressive, but it was the expected result. Hawthorne's eyes, however, remained fixed on Moore. He wanted to see the response, to confirm that even someone with character and confidence would follow the strictest rules when the situation demanded it. Moore's reaction was subtle, almost imperceptible at first. He raised his hand in the salute, but there was something in the movement that made it different from the others. It was not just a mechanical gesture. It was a salute that seemed to carry thought, intention, and a hint of personality. Hawthorne blinked, taken slightly aback. In his long career, he had seen countless soldiers follow orders to the letter, but rarely had he seen one perform the gesture with such individuality. There was a quiet message in that motion, a statement that went beyond obedience. Hawthorne's curiosity deepened. He took a moment to observe more closely. The sergeant's eyes met his own, and in that brief contact, Hawthorne felt as if he were being assessed, evaluated by someone who had a deep understanding of duty and honor. There was no disrespect in Moore's gaze, only a calm, unwavering sense of self. It was as if the salute was more than a gesture. It was a reflection of the man himself. Hawthorne had always believed that leadership was about command and control, but in that moment, he realized that there was another dimension to it. Respect earned through character, not fear. The other guards remained perfectly still, but Hawthorne found his attention drawn entirely to Moore. There was a story in that single salute, a story that spoke of years of training, experience, and a quiet sense of personal integrity. Hawthorne wondered about the moments that had shaped this man, the choices he had made, and the principles he held dear. It was unusual, even unsettling, to be confronted with such composed individuality in a setting defined by strict uniformity. As he continued to study more, Hawthorne began to notice other details he had overlooked in his initial inspection. The subtle way Moore adjusted the strap of his helmet without breaking his stance. The careful alignment of his boots, which, while perfectly polished, suggested a man who paid attention to the smallest things. Every gesture was deliberate, precise, and meaningful. It was a reminder to Hawthorne that true discipline was not just about following orders blindly. It was about understanding the purpose behind each action. Hawthorne took a slow breath, feeling a mix of admiration and curiosity. He had always prided himself on knowing his soldiers, on being able to predict their actions and reactions. Yet here was a man who challenged that assumption, who brought an element of unpredictability without breaking protocol. Hawthorne felt a flicker of respect, tinged with the realization that he had much to learn, even after decades of service. The courtyard was silent except for the echo of boots and the soft rustle of fabric. The sun continued to shine down, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Hawthorne took another step forward, his mind racing with thoughts about leadership, obedience, and individuality. He had come to inspect a ceremonial guard, expecting routine precision and predictable discipline. Instead, he had encountered a man whose single salute conveyed depth, courage, and quiet defiance within the bounds of respect. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Hawthorne's usual confidence wavered, replaced by a sense of anticipation. He wondered what would happen next, how Moore would respond to further commands, and what lessons might be hidden in these small gestures. It was a reminder that even in the most controlled environments, human character could shine through, revealing truths that rigid rules alone could never teach. Hawthorne's inspection continued slowly, his attention divided between the line of guards and the singular presence of Moore. Each step, each motion was observed with a careful eye. He realized that leadership was not only about giving orders, but also about recognizing and valuing the integrity of those under one's command. Moore's presence was a quiet challenge, a subtle test of Hawthorne's understanding of honor and respect. By the time Hawthorne finished his initial walk along the line of guards, he had made a decision. He would pay close attention to Moore, not only for the sake of discipline, but also for the insights that could be gained from observing a man who balanced obedience with character. The courtyard, once a simple stage for ceremony, had become a place of reflection and understanding. Hawthorne's perspective was already beginning to shift, though he did not fully realize it yet. As the inspection continued, Hawthorne could feel a subtle energy in the air, a tension between strict protocol and the individual spirit embodied by Moore. It was an energy that demanded careful attention, for it was in these small, human moments that true lessons about leadership and respect were often found. Hawthorne knew, deep down, that this encounter would remain with him long after the ceremonial inspection was complete. And so, with measured steps and a watchful eye, Colonel Hawthorne moved along the line, observing each guard with scrutiny, yet always returning his gaze to the man whose single salute had already begun to teach him a lesson he had not expected. Colonel James Hawthorne had just witnessed a salute that unsettled him in a way he hadn't expected. He had seen countless soldiers follow orders throughout his career, each one moving with mechanical precision, almost like machines. Yet Sergeant Elias Moore's response was different. It was as if the salute carried a story of its own, a quiet, unspoken message that neither defied the rules nor surrendered completely to them. Hawthorne could not stop thinking about it. There was something about Moore that intrigued him, and as he stood in the royal courtyard, he realized that this simple gesture had already left a lasting impression. Hawthorne took a slow, deliberate step forward, raising his voice once more to ensure that his next command was clear and unmistakable. "Salute again," he ordered, expecting Moore to repeat the motion in the same respectful but individual way. Moore did not hesitate, but this time his salute was slightly longer, a touch more deliberate. His eyes met Hawthorne's, steady and calm, showing no trace of fear or rebellion. There was a confidence in that gaze, a quiet assertion that he was both a soldier and a thinking man, capable of understanding the purpose behind his actions. Hawthorne studied him carefully. He had always believed that soldiers who followed orders unquestioningly were the most dependable, but here was a man who followed orders while still conveying his own sense of judgment. It was unusual, and it stirred a mix of respect and curiosity within the colonel. The rest of the guards remained perfectly aligned, their movements precise and synchronized. Each one mirrored the other, performing their duties with the kind of exactness that Hawthorne had expected. Their uniforms gleamed, weapons held with care, and every detail immaculate. Yet in the midst of this perfect formation, Moore stood out like a single tree in a vast, orderly forest. He was not breaking the rules, but he was also not entirely conforming to the mechanical motions of the others. There was a subtle difference, a nuance in his demeanor that made him memorable. Hawthorne could not ignore it. He decided to observe more closely, walking slowly along the line of guards, eyes never leaving Moore. Each step was measured, deliberate, giving the impression of authority and calm control. As he approached the sergeant, he noticed small details that only a trained eye could see. The angle of Moore's wrist in the salute, the subtle tension in his shoulders, and the way he balanced himself perfectly without appearing stiff. It all spoke of years of disciplined training combined with self-awareness. Hawthorne realized that Moore was not just performing a salute, he was conveying respect with thoughtfulness. It was a reminder that discipline did not mean the absence of individuality. Hawthorne decided to test Moore further. He raised his hand again, preparing to give a more complex command. This was a moment to see how the sergeant would respond under pressure, to determine if he would follow orders strictly or if there was room for independent thought within the bounds of duty. "Present arms," Hawthorne commanded. The guards moved as one, bringing their weapons up in perfect unison. The sound of metal and the flash of polished steel filled the courtyard. Hawthorne nodded slightly, satisfied with the display of precision. Then he turned his attention to Moore. The sergeant raised his weapon, but his motion had a subtle distinction. While it followed the correct form, there was a fluidity and confidence in it that made it seem almost natural, rather than mechanical. Hawthorne's brow furrowed. This was not defiance, but neither was it blind obedience. It was a statement that Moore understood the purpose behind the order and executed it with awareness and pride. The colonel took another step closer, lowering his voice slightly, though still audible across the courtyard. "Maintain your position. Hold the stance." The guards obeyed instantly, but Moore's expression remained composed, almost as if he were listening with full attention rather than merely responding out of habit. Hawthorne noticed the subtle way Moore's eyes scanned the line of soldiers behind him, checking for alignment and precision. It was a leadership quality, quiet and unspoken, emerging naturally even under strict rules. Hawthorne began to appreciate that Moore's presence was not just about performing commands. It was about setting an example, guiding others through action rather than words. Hawthorne's mind began to wander as he watched Moore. He thought of his years in the army, the countless inspections, drills, and ceremonies he had led. He had always believed that control and obedience were the foundation of order. Yet here was a man demonstrating that discipline and independent thought could coexist, and perhaps even strengthen each other. Hawthorne realized that true respect came not only from giving orders, but also from recognizing the judgment and integrity of those who carried them out. Moore's salute had already begun to teach him a lesson he had never expected. The sun climbed higher in the sky, casting sharp shadows across the courtyard. The heat was mild, but the intensity of the moment made it feel charged. Hawthorne continued his inspection, moving along the line with slow, purposeful steps, yet his eyes kept returning to Moore. Each motion of the sergeant's body seemed deliberate, thoughtful, and perfectly balanced. Hawthorne could see that Moore had practiced these movements countless times, yet he had also added something uniquely his own, a sense of presence, confidence, and awareness that went beyond memorized actions. Hawthorne decided to test Moore's attention to detail in a less conventional way. Without speaking, he made a small, subtle motion with his hand, a gesture that only a sharp observer might notice. Moore's eyes caught it immediately. Instead of reacting with surprise or hesitation, he adjusted his stance ever so slightly, maintaining perfect composure while acknowledging the subtle cue. Hawthorne felt a surge of respect. This was a man who was fully aware of his surroundings, attentive to every detail, and capable of adapting without losing composure. In that single moment, Moore had demonstrated qualities that many higher-ranking officers, including Hawthorne himself, had spent years trying to cultivate. The other guards continued their duties, perfectly aligned and synchronized, yet they did not possess the same quiet confidence and presence as Moore. Hawthorne began to see that leadership was more than authority. It was about understanding, perception, and the ability to inspire through action. Moore's calm, steady demeanor had already begun to shift Hawthorne's thinking. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the impact was undeniable. After a few more moments of careful observation, Hawthorne lowered his hand and allowed the guards to relax slightly. The tension in the courtyard eased, but the focus remained on Moore. The sergeant's posture remained impeccable, his gaze steady, and his breathing controlled. Hawthorne realized that discipline, when combined with awareness and judgment, created a presence that commanded respect without demanding fear. Moore had managed to embody that principle in a way that words could never fully capture. Hawthorne's thoughts returned to the beginning of his career. He remembered the young soldiers he had trained, many of whom had followed orders perfectly but lacked the confidence to think for themselves. He thought about the officers who had taught him, the ones who valued precision above all else, and the lessons he had learned about authority and control. Yet here, in this sunlit courtyard, he was seeing a different approach. Moore's actions were demonstrating that true strength lay not only in obedience, but in the ability to act thoughtfully within the framework of rules. As the inspection continued, Hawthorne decided to speak directly to Moore. "Sergeant Moore," he called, his voice carrying authority yet tinged with curiosity. Moore's gaze shifted to meet Hawthorne's, steady and attentive. There was no hesitation, no sign of fear. Hawthorne took a careful step closer, observing every detail of the sergeant's expression, stance, and readiness. "You perform your duties well," Hawthorne said. "Better than most, but I want to know, how do you maintain such composure under scrutiny? How do you balance obedience with awareness?" Moore's response was measured, thoughtful, and precise. "Colonel, I have learned that a soldier's duty is not only to follow orders, but also to understand them. Respect for authority is important, but so is awareness, judgment, and integrity. I do not act recklessly, nor do I blindly obey. I strive to perform my duties with full understanding and presence." Hawthorne nodded slowly, absorbing the words. He had expected a simple answer, perhaps a display of routine training, but Moore's reply revealed a depth of thought that was rare in a soldier. It was a reminder that leadership and discipline were not just about commands. They were about character, judgment, and awareness. Moore's calm and considered approach had already begun to reshape Hawthorne's perspective on command and respect. As the day progressed, Hawthorne continued to observe the guards, but his attention remained focused on Moore. Each motion, each gesture, and each response was carefully noted. Hawthorne realized that this inspection was unlike any he had conducted before. It was not merely a test of discipline. It had become a lesson in leadership, awareness, and the true meaning of respect. By the time the inspection ended, Hawthorne knew that he had encountered something exceptional. Moore was not only an exemplary soldier, he was a model of quiet strength, intelligence, and integrity. Hawthorne walked away from the line of guards with a newfound understanding. He had come to ensure obedience, but he was leaving with a lesson that would influence the way he led for years to come. And as Moore returned to his position, standing tall and composed, it was clear that the sergeant had done more than perform a salute. He had demonstrated the power of presence, the value of awareness, and the importance of balancing obedience with character. In that sunlit courtyard, a simple command had become a profound lesson, one that neither Hawthorne nor Moore would soon forget. The sun was slowly beginning its descent, casting long golden shadows across the royal courtyard. Colonel James Hawthorne had spent hours observing the ceremonial guards, his eyes repeatedly drawn to Sergeant Elias Moore. Hawthorne could no longer see him as just another soldier following orders. Moore had become a puzzle, a man who carried his duties with an unusual mixture of respect, confidence, and quiet independence. Every motion he made, every small gesture, seemed to carry intention beyond the surface, and Hawthorne found himself both fascinated and unsettled. He realized that the sergeant's behavior was challenging him in ways he had never experienced before. Hawthorne's curiosity was not idle. He had devoted his entire life to understanding discipline, obedience, and leadership. He had commanded soldiers under fire, taught recruits, and inspected countless formations, yet Moore's composure and individuality were unlike anything he had encountered. The colonel was not one to be easily surprised, but this man had a presence that demanded acknowledgement. It was subtle, almost invisible to anyone who wasn't paying close attention, yet Hawthorne could not ignore it. He decided to test Moore more thoroughly. It was one thing to see a soldier execute commands with slight personal nuance, but it was another to understand how he would react when confronted with an unexpected situation. Hawthorne stepped forward and gave a sharp command, "Lower weapons!" The line of guards complied instantly, moving in perfect synchronization. Hawthorne watched the sergeant carefully, noting the precise way Moore followed the order, each movement smooth and deliberate. Yet even in compliance, there was a sense of awareness. Moore's eyes scanned the formation behind him, ensuring that his comrades maintained their posture and focus. He was obedient, yes, but also mindful, a leader within the ranks, even under strict commands. Hawthorne's mind raced. He had often seen soldiers who excelled at obedience, but rarely had he encountered someone who combined such flawless execution with judgment and insight. Moore's calm composure suggested that he was thinking several steps ahead, that he was aware of not only his own actions, but also the broader context. Hawthorne had always believed that obedience was a virtue in itself, but he was beginning to understand that true respect was earned not just through following orders, but through thoughtfulness and awareness. He decided to issue a more challenging command, one that tested both precision and adaptability. "Prepare for inspection, stand at attention, then execute a full ceremonial turn to the left on my signal." The guards stiffened, ready to follow the instructions as they had been trained to do countless times. Hawthorne's eyes, however, remained on Moore. He wanted to see if the sergeant would execute the movements with exactness, or if his presence of mind would allow for small, deliberate adjustments that reflected awareness rather than mechanical obedience. Moore responded with fluidity and precision. His movements were flawless, yet there was a subtle difference that Hawthorne could not ignore. The sergeant's posture conveyed confidence, and his eyes occasionally flicked to the colonel as if silently checking for approval, then immediately returned to the formation without breaking composure. Every motion seemed intentional, almost like a conversation without words. Hawthorne felt a mixture of admiration and challenge. This man was following orders perfectly, yet he was also asserting his individuality in a manner that was respectful, controlled, and undeniably impactful. The other guards followed the commands as they had been trained, each motion perfectly synchronized with the next. Their uniforms shone under the afternoon sun, their movements almost hypnotic in their precision. But it was Moore who captured Hawthorne's full attention. There was something magnetic about the sergeant's calm authority, the way he executed orders while remaining distinctly himself. Hawthorne realized that Moore's approach was not a threat to discipline. It was a demonstration of how respect and individuality could coexist within even the strictest military environment. Hawthorne stepped closer, lowering his voice but maintaining authority. "Sergeant Moore, hold your stance and maintain focus. Observe your comrades and report any misalignment." Moore's eyes met his, steady and attentive, and he nodded ever so slightly, acknowledging the command without hesitation. What struck Hawthorne most was the subtle confidence in that gesture. Moore was not just a follower. He was someone who understood responsibility, who carried his duty with thought and awareness. Hawthorne had always believed that obedience was the foundation of respect, but now he saw that awareness and judgment could enhance it in ways he had not anticipated. As the afternoon wore on, Hawthorne continued to issue commands, each one slightly more complex than the last. Moore executed them all with a combination of precision and thoughtfulness that was mesmerizing. The sergeant's attention to detail, his awareness of the formation, and his subtle guidance of the other guards revealed leadership qualities that went beyond rank or title. Hawthorne observed quietly, reflecting on his own approach to command. He had always valued obedience above all else, but Moore's actions suggested that leadership was not merely about giving orders. It was about understanding, guidance, and silent influence. At one point, Hawthorne decided to challenge Moore in a subtle, unexpected way. He made a small, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand, a signal that could be easily overlooked. Moore's eyes immediately noticed the motion, and without breaking form, he adjusted his stance just enough to acknowledge it. Hawthorne was struck. This was not rote obedience. This was awareness and attention to detail, a silent communication between the officer and the sergeant. Moore had demonstrated that he was not merely following commands. He was interpreting them thoughtfully, understanding the context and implications of each action. Hawthorne's respect for Moore grew with each passing moment. He realized that this encounter was more than an inspection. It was a lesson. He had come to enforce discipline, to ensure order, and to verify obedience. But what he was witnessing was the embodiment of a principle that he had not fully appreciated. That true leadership required both adherence to rules and the capacity for independent thought. Moore's presence was quietly revolutionary, a reminder that discipline and individuality were not mutually exclusive. The other guards continued their duties flawlessly, their movements synchronized and precise. Yet there was no doubt in Hawthorne's mind that Moore's approach was subtly influencing them as well. The sergeant's calm authority, his quiet confidence, and his thoughtful execution of commands created an atmosphere that was both disciplined and alive with presence. Hawthorne could see the difference immediately. While the other guards performed their actions mechanically, Moore's influence was evident in the subtle adjustments and attentiveness of those around him. He had not only mastered his own performance, but was quietly elevating the performance of the entire formation. Hawthorne took a deep breath, feeling a mixture of pride and surprise. He had always believed that leadership was about authority, about giving orders and expecting compliance. But here was a man who demonstrated that influence and respect could be achieved through presence, awareness, and thoughtful action. It was a lesson that Hawthorne had never fully appreciated in his decades of service. He realized that this single sergeant had quietly challenged his understanding of command and respect in ways that were profound and lasting. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting a warm, golden light across the courtyard. Shadows stretched long over the polished marble floor, and the entire scene seemed to take on a more dramatic, almost cinematic quality. Hawthorne's mind was focused entirely on Moore. He wanted to understand how the sergeant maintained such calm and control, how he balanced obedience with individuality, and how he carried the weight of responsibility with such grace. It was a study in contrast, the strict discipline of the military environment versus the thoughtful, aware presence of one extraordinary man. Hawthorne decided to speak to Moore once more, this time to test the sergeant's judgment directly. "Sergeant, tell me, how do you maintain focus under scrutiny while still ensuring that your comrades remain aligned and disciplined?" Moore's gaze met the colonel's steadily, unwavering and calm. He took a measured breath before responding. "Colonel," Moore said, "focus comes from understanding the purpose of my duty. Discipline is not just about following commands. It is about knowing why those commands exist and ensuring that every action serves the greater good. I observe my comrades because their alignment affects the entire formation, just as my actions affect them. Attention to detail, awareness, and judgment are as important as obedience. They allow us to perform as one, while still maintaining our integrity as individuals." Hawthorne listened intently. He had expected a simple answer, perhaps a mechanical repetition of training principles, but Moore's response revealed a depth of understanding and thought that was rare. It was a lesson in leadership, in awareness, and in the subtle power of presence. Hawthorne realized that he had been taught to value obedience above all else, but here was a man showing him that respect and influence could be achieved through thoughtful action and quiet authority. As the day drew to a close, Hawthorne reflected on the events of the afternoon. The ceremonial inspection had transformed into a lesson in leadership, presence, and the balance between obedience and individuality. Moore had demonstrated that a soldier could follow orders flawlessly while still maintaining awareness, judgment, and integrity. He had shown that true respect was earned not through fear, but through consistent, thoughtful action. Hawthorne knew that this encounter would stay with him for a long time. Moore's quiet authority, his calm confidence, and his ability to convey so much through simple gestures had already left a lasting impression. The colonel realized that this sergeant had done more than perform his duties. He had taught a lesson in leadership, discipline, and the power of presence that few officers ever experienced. By the time Hawthorne finally left the courtyard, the sun had dipped below the horizon, casting the palace in the soft glow of twilight. Moore returned to his post, standing tall and composed, the embodiment of discipline and awareness. Hawthorne walked away with a new understanding, a newfound respect for the quiet strength that comes from balance, judgment, and thoughtful action. In that golden light, a single salute had become a profound lesson, one that would influence the colonel's approach to leadership and command for years to come. As Hawthorne approached his own quarters, he replayed the events of the day over and over in his mind. Each moment with Moore seemed to carry layers of meaning. It wasn't just that the sergeant had followed orders flawlessly. It was the way he did it, thoughtfully, intentionally, and with a presence that seemed to lift the entire formation. Hawthorne had always believed that obedience was the highest virtue in a soldier, that precision and conformity were the pillars of respect. Yet here was a man who embodied those principles while adding something far more powerful: awareness, judgment, and integrity. Hawthorne sat quietly in his study, the soft glow of the evening casting long shadows across the room. He poured himself a cup of tea, but even as he lifted it to his lips, his thoughts returned to Moore. The sergeant's salute, his subtle gestures, and his unspoken communication had challenged the colonel's understanding of command. Hawthorne realized that he had spent decades teaching soldiers to obey without question, yet he had rarely considered the importance of encouraging independent thought within the bounds of discipline. Moore had shown him that respect could be earned not only through authority, but also through presence, thoughtfulness, and character. The colonel leaned back in his chair and thought about the countless inspections he had conducted over the years. He remembered the young recruits who had followed his commands to the letter but had lacked initiative. He remembered the senior officers who had valued precision above all else, often dismissing individuality as a threat to order. Yet Moore had demonstrated that individuality and discipline were not only compatible, they could enhance one another. The sergeant had executed commands with flawless precision, yet he had also conveyed a sense of self-awareness that made his actions meaningful, even inspiring. Hawthorne realized that this lesson extended beyond the courtyard, beyond the ceremonial duties of the Royal Guards. It applied to every aspect of leadership. True command, he thought, was not about forcing obedience or demanding compliance. It was about understanding the strengths and character of those under one's command, guiding them thoughtfully, and allowing them to act with judgment within the framework of discipline. Moore's calm authority had reminded him of this truth in the most unexpected and profound way. The next morning, Hawthorne returned to the courtyard, but this time with a different mindset. He no longer approached the inspection as a test of compliance alone. Instead, he observed the guards with an eye toward understanding their character, their awareness, and their ability to think within the rules. Moore stood at his post, as composed and attentive as ever, and Hawthorne felt a renewed sense of respect. He realized that this man had subtly transformed the way he viewed leadership and discipline. Hawthorne decided to address the entire line of guards, not just Moore. "Today," he said, his voice carrying clearly across the courtyard, "I have observed something remarkable. Discipline is not just about following orders. It is about understanding them, executing them thoughtfully, and maintaining awareness of the impact of every action. Sergeant Moore has demonstrated this principle in ways that inspire not only respect but also reflection. Let his example guide you as you perform your duties, not through fear, but through understanding and integrity. The guards remained at attention, listening carefully. Moore's eyes met Hawthorne's, and there was a subtle exchange of acknowledgement between them, a recognition that something significant had passed from one to the other. Hawthorne felt a sense of satisfaction that went beyond the usual outcome of an inspection. He had not only witnessed precision and discipline, but had also encountered leadership expressed through awareness, thoughtfulness, and quiet authority. Moore had taught him a lesson that would endure far longer than the ceremonial routines of the palace. Over the following days, Hawthorne found himself reflecting more and more on the encounter. He considered how often he had relied solely on authority to command respect, without recognizing the value of independent thought and judgment. He thought about the soldiers he had trained, the officers he had worked alongside, and the many years he had spent enforcing rules with precision. Moore's calm, thoughtful approach had shown him that respect was earned not by demanding obedience alone, but by demonstrating character, awareness, and integrity. Hawthorne began to implement subtle changes in his approach to leadership. He paid closer attention to the individuality of his soldiers, encouraging them to understand the purpose behind their actions. He emphasized awareness and judgment alongside obedience, fostering an environment in which discipline was paired with thoughtfulness. Moore's example became a guiding principle, a reminder that the most effective leaders inspire through understanding, presence, and integrity rather than authority alone. Moore himself continued his duties with the same calm composure as always. He did not seek recognition or reward, nor did he demand attention. Yet his influence was undeniable. Other guards began to emulate his attentive awareness, his quiet confidence, and his thoughtful execution of commands. The formation itself seemed to benefit from his presence, as if his calm authority had subtly elevated the performance of the entire group. Hawthorne observed this with a sense of quiet pride. He realized that true leadership could create a ripple effect, influencing not just one individual, but an entire team through example and presence. In the weeks that followed, Hawthorne made it a point to spend more time observing his soldiers, focusing not only on compliance but also on the quality of their awareness, their understanding, and their judgment. He encouraged conversations with his team, seeking to understand their perspectives and insights. The change was subtle but powerful. Soldiers began to respond with greater engagement, taking ownership of their duties and demonstrating initiative within the framework of discipline. Moore's influence, though silent and understated, had become a catalyst for meaningful transformation. Hawthorne also took time to reflect on his personal growth. He realized that leadership was not a static skill to be mastered, but a dynamic practice that required ongoing reflection, humility, and openness to learning. Moore's quiet authority had challenged him to reconsider long-held assumptions and to embrace a more holistic understanding of command. Hawthorne felt a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that the lessons of the courtyard would guide him in his interactions with soldiers and colleagues for years to come. One evening, as the palace grew quiet and the sun set in brilliant shades of orange and pink, Hawthorne found Moore standing at his post, calm and unwavering as always. The colonel approached him, feeling a deep sense of respect and gratitude. "Sergeant," he said, his voice quiet but sincere, "your actions over the past days have taught me more than I could have imagined. You have shown that discipline and awareness, obedience and judgment can coexist beautifully. Thank you for the example you have set." Moore acknowledged the words with a simple nod, his expression calm and composed. He did not seek praise, nor did he revel in recognition. Yet Hawthorne felt that the acknowledgement was meaningful, a silent bond of respect forged through understanding and example. In that moment, the colonel knew that the impact of Moore's actions would resonate far beyond the confines of the courtyard. As Hawthorne walked away that evening, he reflected on the power of subtlety and presence. A single salute, executed with awareness and integrity, had changed his perspective on leadership. He realized that respect was not merely demanded. It was earned through thoughtful action, quiet authority, and the courage to balance obedience with individuality. Moore had demonstrated all of these qualities, leaving an indelible mark on Hawthorne's understanding of what it truly meant to lead. The courtyard, now bathed in the soft glow of twilight, seemed transformed as well. What had once been a stage for rigid ceremony now felt like a space where lessons in character, awareness, and leadership had been quietly imparted. Hawthorne knew that he would return to this place many times in his mind, recalling the subtle gestures, the deliberate actions, and the silent communication that had defined his encounter with Moore. It was a story of discipline elevated by thoughtfulness, of obedience enriched by awareness, and of leadership illuminated by integrity. In the months and years that followed, Hawthorne applied the lessons he had learned in countless inspections, drills, and strategic decisions. He fostered an environment in which soldiers were encouraged to think, observe, and act with both obedience and judgment. The ripple effect of Moore's example became evident as units performed with greater cohesion, awareness, and quiet confidence. Leadership had become a shared responsibility, a collaboration between those who gave commands and those who executed them thoughtfully. Hawthorne never forgot the sergeant who had changed his perspective. Moore continued his duties with the same calm composure, but his influence persisted long after the immediate events of the inspection. The colonel understood that true leadership was not defined solely by authority or rank, but by the ability to inspire, guide, and elevate others through presence, awareness, and integrity. In this way, a single salute had become a powerful lesson, one that would shape the culture of discipline and respect within the Royal Guards for years to come. And so, as the palace settled into quiet night, the story of Colonel Hawthorne and Sergeant Moore became one not only of military precision, but of leadership transformed by observation, reflection, and subtle inspiration. The lesson was clear. True respect and effective leadership arise not from the blind enforcement of rules, but from the combination of discipline, awareness, and the courage to act thoughtfully within the bounds of duty. Moore had shown the way, and Hawthorne had learned it, a lesson that would endure far longer than any ceremonial display or formal inspection.